The auction yard smelled like dry straw and old wood, and the particular kind of dust that only rises when too many boots shuffle over the same packed earth. It was the kind of morning that starts cold and stays that way, the sky sitting low and gray over the hills like it had no intention of lifting. Farmers stood in clusters along the fence rails, their breath coming out in small white clouds, their eyes moving over the animals in the pen, with the practiced patience of men who had done this many times before. She stood a little apart from the crowd. She was not the kind of woman people noticed right away. Her coat was too large for her, the cuffs folded back twice to free her hands. Her boots were clean but worn through at the left heel. She had the look of someone who had been doing the work of two people for a long time and had simply gotten used to it. She held a small cloth purse in both hands, and anyone watching closely would have seen how tightly she held it. $10. That was all she had. $10 for feed or supplies, or whatever the farm needed most. She had told herself on the walk over that she would spend it carefully. She had told herself she was only coming to look. Then she saw the cow. It stood alone at the far end of the pen, well away from the better animals. It was not a pretty creature. Its coat was rough and dull, a muddy brindle that seemed to collect shadow even in open light. One ear sat slightly lower than the other. Its ribs showed more than they should have. The other farmers had already passed it over, not even bothering to slow their steps. Someone had written on the tag hanging from its neck, "No milk production, no known pedigree, minimum bid $10." She stood at the fence and looked at the cow for a long time. The animal stood very still in a way that had nothing to do with defeat. It was not the stillness of a sick creature or a broken one. It was something quieter than that. Patient, almost. It turned its heavy head slowly and looked back at her, and there was a steadiness in its dark eyes that she could not explain but recognized in the way you recognize certain kinds of weather. She looked at the markings along its shoulder and down its left flank. An unusual pattern, pale lines against the dark coat, like old brushwork on weathered wood. She had seen something like that once in a farming almanac her grandfather had kept, a book with hand-drawn illustrations of heritage, breeds her grandfather had spoken about, with a reverence most people reserved for things far more important than cattle. She opened her purse. When she placed her bid, the auctioneer almost laughed. When she led the cow out through the gate on a borrowed rope, the laughter came from the fence line, easy and certain, the kind that carries far in cold morning air. The walk home was 2 miles of dirt road, and she felt every inch of it. The cow moved slowly beside her, unhurried, its hooves marking the frozen mud with a soft, deliberate sound. She did not rush it. She had learned early that rushing a frightened animal only made things worse, and so she walked at the cow's pace, which was slow and even and strangely dignified, as if the animal had decided long ago that it would not be hurried by anyone. The cold had sharpened since morning. Her breath came out in small clouds, and the borrowed rope was stiff in her hand. She kept glancing at the cow's flank, at those pale markings that curved and drifted along the dark coat. In the flat gray light of the road, they looked even more deliberate than they had in the auction pen, like something drawn by someone who knew what they were doing. She tried to remember everything her grandfather had said about the old breeds. He had not been a man who talked much, but when he did talk about cattle, he had a way of going still and serious that she had not seen him apply to anything else. He had spoken of certain bloodlines the way other men spoke of good land. Rare, he had said, patient animals, strong bone. They carry it in the body. Girl, you learn to read it, same as you read the sky. She had been young then. She had not understood what he meant about reading an animal's body the same way you read weather. She thought she understood it a little better now. Her neighbor's truck passed her on the road. It slowed, and she heard the window come down. The voice from the cab was not cruel exactly, but it carried the easy confidence of someone who had already made up his mind. He asked if that was the animal from the Delaney auction. She said it was. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the cow with the flat, practical gaze of a man who had bought and sold cattle all his life. He said he had heard someone paid $10 for it. She said that was right. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close enough to one that she felt it settle somewhere behind her sternum. He said he supposed feed was cheap this winter then, and drove on. She watched the truck disappear around the bend and felt the familiar weight of other people's certainty pressing against her chest. It was a feeling she had grown up with, and she knew by now that it did not mean anything. It was just the sound doubt made when it lived in someone else's mouth instead of your own. She turned back to the road. The cow walked beside her, steady and unhurried, its breath rising in slow white puffs. When her small farm finally appeared at the end of the road, she felt something loosen in her chest. The old barn, the empty pen waiting. She opened the gate and led the cow in. She gave the cow the better stall, the one that still held warmth from the summer and had a floor of packed earth that stayed dry even when the rains came sideways. It was not much, but it was the best she had. She spread fresh straw across the ground, more than she could really afford to use all at once, and watched the cow lower its broad head and smell it with the slow, thorough attention of an animal that was not easily fooled. She brought water in the old tin bucket, the one with the patched seam that still held if you filled it carefully. The cow drank without hesitation, which told her something. A sick animal drinks reluctantly. A frightened one spills. This one simply drank, steady and deliberate, as if it had always known this bucket and this barn. She stood in the doorway for a long time after, watching. The wind had picked up outside, moving through the bare trees at the edge of the property with a low, dry sound. Inside the barn it was still, just the cow breathing, just the straw settling beneath it as it shifted its weight. She thought about the man in the truck. She thought about the way he had made that sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a dismissal, but something in between that managed to contain both. She had heard that sound her whole life, from neighbors, from buyers, from the women at church who watched her leave after her mother passed, and shook their heads as if the sight of her. Grief was a kind of proof that she was not suited for what lay ahead. She had learned not to answer it. The only thing that ever answered a sound like that was time. She ran her hand along the cow's back. The coat was rough in places, patchy where something had rubbed it thin. But the spine beneath was straight, and the flank was broader than it had looked at the auction, broader now that the animal was calm and standing naturally, rather than pressed in against the rail. She noticed the markings again in the lamplight, dark patches on a base of deep reddish brown, arranged in a pattern she could not name but could not stop looking at. They ran along the shoulder and down the left side of the neck, with a kind of deliberate symmetry that did not look accidental. She had seen many cows in her life, and most of them looked like cattle. This one looked like something that had been made carefully. She did not know what that meant yet. She only knew that it meant something. She checked the water once more, adjusted the latch on the stall door, and pulled her coat tighter. Before she left, she paused at the threshold. The cow had already folded its legs beneath itself and settled into the straw with the unhurried ease of an animal that expected to be somewhere for a while. That, too, told her something. She walked back to the house through the cold, her boots quiet on the frozen ground, turning it over in her mind. The next morning came in gray and still, the kind of mornings it sits low over the fields and does not lift until nearly noon. She was up before the light, as she always was, and she went to the barn first thing, before the fire in the stove had done more than take the edge off the kitchen cold. The cow was standing. That was the first thing she noted, standing and calm, ears forward, watching the barn door open with an expression that seemed less like fear and more like mild curiosity. She had seen animals shut down after an auction, spending days pressed into corners and refusing feed. This one had slept, risen, and was ready for the morning. She set fresh hay in the manger, and the cow moved to it without hesitation, pulling at it steadily, working through it with the unhurried focus of an animal that trusted its body to know what it needed. She filled the water bucket, checked the hooves again in the better light, and ran her hands slowly along the animal's spine and ribs. The ribs were present, but not sharp. The spine was prominent, but not sunken. She had been underfed, probably for a season, but she was not broken. There was muscle memory in the body, the kind that comes from good conditioning a long time ago and does not entirely leave. She pressed along the flank gently, and the cow turned her head to watch, patient and unbothered. It was while she was crouching near the left hip that she saw the marking she had half noticed the night before, now clear in the thin morning light that fell through the barn slats. The dark patch there was not random. It came to a distinct edge, almost a line, and within it were two smaller patches, shaped so closely alike that she found herself leaning in. She had never seen a hide pattern quite like it. She had grown up with cattle on this land, and before that at her grandmother's place 2 counties over, and she could not place it. That afternoon she walked the half-mile to the old man, who kept mostly to himself at the edge of the hollow, the one people called before they called anyone official, because he had been farming since before anyone could clearly remember and had a memory for livestock that other people kept almanacs for. He did not come to auctions anymore. His knees had decided that for him, but he still knew things. She described the cow to him while he sat on his porch with a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. She described the build, the temperament, the markings. She did not tell him what she had paid. He listened without interrupting, which was itself unusual. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking out past her toward the tree line, turning something over behind his eyes. Then he asked her one question, just one. And the way he asked it, careful and low, made the back of her neck go still. He asked her if the cow had a notch on the inside of her left ear. Not a tear, not a brand, not a tag hole. A notch, clean and deliberate, like someone had made it with intention. She thought about it. She had checked the cow over carefully the day she brought her home, running her hands along the neck and back and legs the way her own mother had taught her, feeling for lumps, for heat, for anything wrong. But the ears she had only glanced at. She told him she was not certain. He nodded slowly, like that answer told him something too. Then he set down his cold cup and told her about a man who had farmed about 40 miles east of here, back when the old man was still young enough to travel to shows and sales. This man had kept a small herd, never more than 12 animals at once, and he had spent 30 years building the bloodline by hand, not buying fancy stock, selecting, watching, breeding for specific qualities that the show circuit did not always reward, but that the land itself seemed to favor. Good feet, easy temperament, deep body, strong maternal instinct, and a coat pattern that ran true generation after generation, unmistakable once you knew to look for it. The pattern she had described to him matched what he remembered from that herd. He said it slowly and without drama, the way a man says something he wants to be sure is heard correctly. He was not telling her she had found treasure. He was telling her she might be standing closer to something significant than she realized, and that those were different things, and that she ought to be careful not to confuse them before she knew more. She asked him what had happened to that herd. He looked down at his hands. The man had passed some years back, he said. His family had no interest in the land or the animals. The cattle had been sold off at auction in small groups, some going north, some going to people who did not know what they had, and a few going to a dealer who moved stock across several counties without much record keeping. The bloodline had scattered. Most people assumed it was gone. She stood there on his porch steps in the afternoon light, turning all of it over in her mind. The notch. She needed to go look at that ear. She needed to look carefully. He told her one more thing before she left. He said that if she did find that notch, she should not tell anyone. Not yet, not until she understood what she had. Because people had a way of stepping in once they thought something was valuable, and they did not always wait to be invited. She thanked him and started back down the road toward home. The light was going orange over the fields by the time she came through her own gate. The cow was standing near the fence, calm as ever, her broad side catching the last of the sun. She did not rush. That was the first thing she told herself as she walked across the yard toward the fence. She did not rush, because the old man's words were still sitting with her, and she wanted to think clearly before she touched anything or decided anything. The cow turned her heavy head as she approached. Those dark eyes, steady and unhurried, watched her come without a single step backward. That had always been the thing about this animal. She did not startle. She did not push. She simply stood and waited, as if she had been standing in various fields, her whole life waiting for someone to finally look at her properly. She came around to the left side, moving slow and easy, one hand trailing along the rough hair of the cow's back. The animal shifted slightly, a small adjustment of weight, nothing more. She crouched down near the neck and began working her way toward the ear. The light was fading fast now, and she had to lean in close, turning the ear gently in her fingers, feeling along the outer edge where the cartilage folded. She felt it before she saw it. A small notch, no wider than her thumbnail, cut deliberately into the lower fold of the left ear. Clean-edged, old but clear, not a tear from a fence or a bite from another animal. This had been done with intention, done the same way for every animal in that line, generation after generation, so that anyone who knew could find it in a dark barn without a lantern. She stayed crouched there for a long moment with her hand resting on the cow's ear, and the last orange light disappearing behind the far tree line. Her mind went back to what he had said, that the bloodline had scattered, that most people thought it was gone, that a few animals had passed through dealers and auctions and hands that did not know what they were handling. She thought about the auction yard, the way the cow had stood alone in that far pen, ribs showing hide rough, no one giving her a second look. $10, a joke price, a pity price. She straightened up slowly and looked at the cow's face. The cow looked back at her with the same patience she had shown every single day since, coming to this small farm as if she had simply been waiting for the right person to do exactly what had just been done, to crouch down in the fading light and feel for what was there. She laid her palm flat against the cow's broad cheek and stayed quiet for a moment. Then she pulled her hand back, took a breath, and looked out across the field toward the barn. The stars were beginning to show in the east, faint and early, just a few of them yet. The evening air had gone cool and the grass was wet with dew already settling. She needed to think about what to do next. And she needed to think about it carefully because the old man had been right about one thing above all the rest. The calf was coming soon. She did not know exactly when, but she had felt the signs, and now her mind would not let the thought go. She had been watching the cow long enough to read her, and what she had felt under her hands in the fading light was not a guess. The cow's body was changing the way a field changes before rain, quietly, surely, without announcement. She walked back to the barn slowly, letting the cool air settle around her. The old man who kept the property 2 pastures over had said it plainly, weeks ago when she first brought the cow home and he had come to the fence to look. He had not laughed the way the others did. He had just squinted for a long time, and then said that if that cow was what he thought she might be, the timing of the birth would matter more than almost anything else. Not just for the calf's health. For everything. She had not understood him fully then. She was beginning to understand him now. A calf born in poor conditions, in cold mud, in a drafty pen without proper attention, could come into the world already weakened. A calf from bloodlines that had not been seen in this county in a generation needed every advantage the first hours could give it. She had heard enough from her grandmother to know that the first hours were the whole story for a young animal. What the calf drank, how warm it stayed, whether it got up on its own or needed help, all of it mattered in ways that could not be undone later. She pushed open the barn door and stood in the familiar smell of dry hay and old wood. She looked at the stall she had been slowly preparing. The bedding was good, deep, and clean. She had made sure of that. But she thought about the latch on the lower half of the stall door, which had been stiff and slow for 2 weeks. She thought about the water bucket, which hung on a hook that sometimes slipped. Small things. The kind of things that only mattered when everything else was already happening at once, and your hands needed to move fast. She pulled the latch free and worked it back and forth until it swung smooth. She reset the bucket hook and made sure it held firm. She checked the lantern hanging near the post and found enough oil in it for a full night. Then she spread a little more straw in the far corner of the stall, the warmest corner, the one that faced away from the gap under the door, where the night air came through. Outside, something moved in the dark field. She heard the cow shift her weight, heard the soft pull of grass under heavy hooves. Sound was calm and steady, the same way it always was. But tonight she listened differently. She sat down on the old milking stool near the stall entrance and folded her hands in her lap and waited. The night settled around the barn the way cold nights do in late autumn, slow and complete, pressing itself into every crack and corner until the whole building held the chill like a second skin. She did not mind it. She had sat through colder nights than this one, and she had learned long ago that the body adjusts if you let it, if you stop fighting the discomfort and simply breathe through it. The lantern threw a warm circle of light across the straw, and she sat just outside that circle, close enough to see clearly, far enough that the shadows gave her a kind of quiet. She was not anxious, exactly. It was something closer to readiness, the kind of feeling that settles into a person who has been waiting a long time and can now feel the waiting beginning to end. The cow moved inside the stall, a slow, deliberate shifting of weight from one side to the other, the way large animals do when something inside them is changing. She watched the cow's flanks, the rise and fall of breath, the occasional low sound that came up from deep in the chest and meant nothing to anyone who had not spent weeks listening closely. But she had spent weeks listening, and she knew the difference now between the sounds of rest and the sounds of something beginning. She rose quietly from the stool and stepped to the stall gate without rushing. She rested her arms on the top rail and watched. The cow turned her great head and looked at her for a moment, those dark eyes steady and untroubled, the way the animal had always looked at her, with a kind of calm recognition, the recognition of one creature for another that has been present and consistent and not unkind. She spoke softly, not words that meant anything in particular, just a low, even murmur, the kind of sound that carries reassurance without demanding anything back. The cow's ears moved once, forward, and then back to rest. She exhaled slowly through her nose, and then she lowered herself carefully, with the practiced patience of a creature that knows what her body is doing. The woman's heart quickened, but her hands stayed still. She had prepared everything she could prepare. The straw was thick and dry in the warmest corner. The latch opened easily now. The bucket would not slip. The lantern held enough oil to last the whole dark stretch until morning. Outside, the wind moved through the bare field with a low whisper, carrying the smell of frost and turned earth and the faraway trace of wood smoke from some neighbor's chimney. None of them were awake. None of them were watching. Not the men from the auction who had laughed at what she paid, not the neighbors who had counted her losses before they were even losses, not one single person who had shaken their head at the sight of the old cow coming down that dirt road beside her. Only she was here, only she had stayed, and the night was not finished yet. The first sign came quietly, the way most true things do, a shift in breathing, deeper and slower than before, the kind that comes not from exhaustion, but from the body gathering itself for work. The woman recognized it without knowing exactly how she recognized it. Some knowledge lives below words, passed down through watching and doing and staying, when others have gone home. She moved closer to the stall door, but did not open it yet. She only watched. The cow's side rose and fell with a new weight to it. Her legs were folded beneath her in the thick straw, and her head was lifted just slightly, chin out, eyes half closed but present, not sleeping, not resting, waiting, the way animals wait when they know something is already in motion. The woman set the lantern on the hook she had hammered into the post herself, at exactly the right height so the light fell warm and even across the stall without casting hard shadows into the corners. She had thought about that. She had thought about everything she could think of, and now the thinking was finished and the doing had begun. She knelt just inside the stall door. The straw pressed through her worn trousers, and she felt the cold beneath it, the cold of the earth itself, but she did not shift or pull back. She stayed low and stayed still. The cow's ear swiveled once toward her, acknowledged her, and returned to forward. Time passed in the way it does during long waiting, not measured in minutes but in breath and stillness and the small sounds of the barn. A mouse moved somewhere behind the feed wall. The lantern flame bent once in a draft that came from nowhere and settled again. Outside, the wind had quieted, and the silence it left behind felt heavy and full, the way silence feels just before something changes. And then it changed. The woman did not move from her place on the straw. Her hands rested on her knees. She kept her breathing even and low, the same way she had learned to move around skittish animals, the same way her grandmother had once told her the earth itself preferred to be, approached gently and without demand. What she was seeing she had hoped for. She had held the hope carefully, the way you carry something fragile across a muddy yard, not squeezing too tight, not loosening enough to drop it. She had not let herself say it aloud. She had not let herself count on it. But the hope had been there from the first day, from the first time she had really looked at this animal, at the markings, at the bone structure beneath the rough hide, at the quiet certainty the cow carried in every movement. And now the night was opening up around that hope, and the lantern light was steady, and she was here, and she would not look away. The calf came into the world quietly, the way some things do when they have been a long time in the becoming. There was no struggle, no alarm. The old cow shifted her weight, and the woman leaned forward just slightly, and then it was there, wet and trembling on the straw, and the lantern caught it in a warm and golden circle of light. The woman's breath left her in a single long exhale. Her hands tightened briefly on her knees and then released. She had told herself not to expect the markings. She had told herself that the signs she had read in the mother might not pass through, that bloodlines could skip and fade. That hope was not a guarantee. She had repeated these things to herself during the long weeks of waiting, during the mornings when her neighbor's words returned to her without invitation, during the evenings when the feed costs added themselves up in her mind, and the numbers were not kind. But the calf that lay breathing on the straw before her carried every mark she had hoped for. The coloring was distinct and unmistakable, a pattern that did not appear in common cattle. A pattern she had seen once in an old farming almanac her grandfather had kept on a high shelf, a book she had read so many times as a child that certain pages had gone soft at the edges. She had not told anyone about that almanac. She had not told anyone what she was looking for when she walked slowly around that old cow at the auction, hands in her pockets, eyes moving carefully over every line and surface. She had not told anyone because she had not been certain, and because certainty was not something she had been handed freely in her life. The cow turned her head and began to tend to the calf, steady and unhurried, and the woman watched and did not interfere. She stayed on her knees in the straw for a long time. The lantern burned without flickering. Outside, the sky had begun its slow shift from black to the deep blue that comes just before dawn, when the birds have not yet started, but the darkness has already made its decision to leave. She could feel the cold in the boards beneath her, in the air around her shoulders. She did not move. The calf made its first sound, a soft and uncertain call, and the mother answered with a low rumble, felt more than heard, and the woman pressed one hand briefly to her own mouth and held it there. She was thinking about the $10. She was thinking about the walk home from the auction, the sound of laughter behind her on the road, the way she had kept her chin level and her eyes on the path ahead. She was thinking about all of it at once, and it did not hurt the way it used to. The calf lifted its head, the calf lifted its head, and she saw its eyes for the first time. They were dark and calm, too calm for something so new to the world, and they caught the lantern light in a way that made her breath catch in her throat. The markings were already clear. Along the calf's left flank, running in an unbroken line from shoulder to hip, was a band of deep chestnut, bordered so cleanly against the white it looked as though someone had drawn it with purpose. The same pattern her neighbors had called smudged, the same pattern the auctioneer had called a defect. On the calf it was perfect. On the calf if it was unmistakable. She had seen drawings of this bloodline once in an old agricultural pamphlet she had found tucked behind a shelf in the feed store. The pamphlet was faded and soft at the edges, and she had read it carefully because she read everything she could find about cattle, even things that seemed too far beyond her reach to matter. The markings in those drawings matched what she was looking at now. She had not been certain, not fully, not until this moment. But she had been certain enough to spend her last $10, and she had been certain enough to carry that quietly through all the weeks of mud and doubt and laughter, and now the answer was lying in the straw in front of her, breathing steadily, already trying to bring its front legs beneath its body. She did not rush it. She sat back on her heels and watched the calf work at standing the way only newborn animals do, with a kind of stubborn, graceless determination that is also somehow dignified. The mother kept close, her breathing slow, her large body warm and steady in the cold barn air. The woman had her hand resting on the old cow's side without quite realizing she had placed it there. The calf got its front legs under, then its back, then lost them again, and rested with its chin in the straw. She smiled. She had not smiled like that in a long time, with her whole face, with nothing held back. It was the kind of smile that only comes when something you believed in when no one else did has finally proven itself. Not to them, but to you first. That was the part that mattered most. She had known something, she had trusted it, and the land or the animal or something older and quieter than either of them had answered. Outside the barn she could hear the first bird now. Just one, testing the morning, uncertain whether the light was ready. The sky through the gap in the boards was pale gray, almost silver. The calf rested. The mother stood. The woman stayed exactly where she was, not wanting to leave this moment before it had fully settled, not wanting to carry it out into the day until she had held it long enough to know it was real. The bird outside called again, twice this time, more certain. Then another answered from somewhere across the field, and the morning began in earnest whether she was ready for it or not. She rose slowly from the straw, her knees stiff, her back aching in the particular way that comes from hours crouched in a barn, and she stood for a moment with both hands braced on her thighs. The calf lifted its head at the movement. The mother turned to look at her, steady and patient, the same way she had looked at her the first morning after the auction. Across the fence in the pale light, as if she had already decided the woman could be trusted. She pulled the barn door open and stepped out into the gray. The air was cool and smelled of wet soil and the last of the night. The fields stretched out ahead of her, quiet, still holding the dark in their low places. She stood at the edge of the yard and breathed it in. The same yard, the same leaning fence, the same road at the end of the drive where the trucks had slowed to stare, where voices had carried through the summer heat, with words she had not forgotten and did not need to anymore. She did not feel triumph exactly. It was something quieter than that, something that had no good word for it in ordinary conversation. It was the feeling of having stayed, of having looked at something no one else wanted and seen it clearly and not looked away. The world would have its reaction soon enough. The man from the county who knew heritage breeds would come when she sent word. The neighbors would hear. Word would move through town the way it always did. quick and unstoppable. There would be people who nodded as if they had never doubted her, and she would let them nod. But standing here, between the barn and the open field, with the calf still damp behind her, and the morning just beginning to show itself, none of that had arrived yet. She walked back inside. The calf had its legs under it again. It was trembling with the effort, small muscles working against its own weight, stubborn in the way that new things are stubborn. The mother lowered her head and breathed warm air along its back. The calf steadied. It found its footing. It stood. She watched it take its first full steps in the straw and felt something in her chest loosen. Something she had been holding tightly for a very long time. Without quite admitting it, she had come to this farm with almost nothing. She had spent her last $10 on something everyone said was worthless. She had fed it and watched it, and trusted what she saw when the easier thing would have been to agree with the doubt. The calf stood in the straw. The light came through the boards. The day began.